So if you know anything about Unreal Engine 5, you would know that Unreal Engine 5 uses blueprints and also C++. We're not going to be covering C++ in this course. We're going to be doing everything inside of blueprints. Blueprints are much easier. And in most cases, blueprints are actually enough for what you're trying to do. You know, like in most games, and 90% of the things that you do in Unreal Engine 5, blueprints are just going to be enough. You won't really need C++ unless you really want to use it. But like, especially if you're a beginner, it doesn't really make sense to use C++ because it's like, much harder as well to learn. All right, so let's go ahead and get started with the blueprints. So in order for me to give you like an intro to blueprints, I'm going to actually teach you how to create a timer system and how to sort of like, when you play the game, a timer should start and then you should have a specific amount of time to sort of reach the end of the game, which would be, I think in this case, it would be, if I just jump over this, it would be basically just like reaching this area, like this area where we would eventually have our spaceship. Right now we don't really have anything here, but yeah, we would have to just reach this area for us to win the game. All right, and the player start, I'm going to move this down. It's going to move this, well, maybe not to the end, but I'm just going to move it like somewhere across a little bit farther, just so I can like, demonstrate the timer system for you guys. All right, so what we need to do is that if you remember, we created a game mode. So I'm just going to go to content, blueprints, and then you're going to see this game mode underscore tutorial. This is a blueprint class that we created. What are the different types of blueprint classes? If you right click and just go to blueprint class, you can see that we have some common blueprint classes. I'm just going to give you some sort of like some explanations for these basic ones, but obviously there are a whole bunch of different blueprint classes which you're going to sort of learn as you sort of, just advance in your game development journey. We're not going to be covering any of the advanced ones. The ones we're going to be covering are going to be super, super easy to learn. Actors are essentially basically any object which can be sort of like just placed in the world and that like does anything. Like, so actors would basically be like this rock. This rock is an actor, right? All these assets, individual assets right here, these are actors, right? And if you have a blueprint actor, what you can do is you can basically make them perform certain tasks, right? So when we, let's say, when we have this rock right here, right? What we can do is we can say that maybe when the character steps on this rock, right? Then we can end the game, right? Then that means the character won the game because this is the rock that needs to be sort of stepped on for the character to reach the final point, right? We can do that. Or we can even create like any sort of object in which if the character collides with it, if the character has any sort of collision with it, that means the player has won the game or player has lost the game or player gets damaged or anything like that. We can control all that logic from blueprint actors, right? So if I just right click again and go to blueprint class, those are actors. Pawns are very similar to actors, but the only difference between pawns and actors is that pawns can be sort of played by your game's players, right? So if you even read the definition here, so pawn is an actor that can be possessed and receive input from a controller. So anything which the player can move or player can sort of give any sort of input to like, get any sort of result, that is essentially a pawn, right? And character is very similar to a pawn, any pawn that can walk around. So our character, our main character, which we're, sort of walking around and doing stuff with, that essentially is a character. And so after that game mode base, I purposefully skipped player controller because we're not going to be using this one in this course. And we're not going to be using actor component or scene component either. We are going to be using game mode base. So what a game mode is that basically it defines sort of rules and like all the systems in a game. It can sort of define those and it can sort of store those. So I mentioned the timer system, right? All the coding for the timer system is going to be done inside the game mode base, right? So that's a basic introduction for blueprints. If you didn't understand anything, it's perfectly fine. I just gave you like a high level overview of it. You're not supposed to sort of understand how everything works and all that stuff. It is pretty complicated. We are going to get into that in just a bit. So what we can do now is that we can just essentially go inside the game mode tutorial. And you can see that we have a bunch of settings here, but we don't really see any blueprints that we can sort of, code with or program with. So you can see this line up here. If you just click open full blueprint editor, if you click that, we can basically get this full blueprint editor in which we can sort of code and in which we can sort of create events and we can do all the programming and all that stuff. Now, if you have any sort of programming experience in like Python or C++ or any other programming language, that is going to be extremely helpful here. So I'm going to give you guys a very quick overview of how exactly programming works inside of Unreal Engine 5 because this is very different from like traditional programming, right? If you have any idea how normal programming works, is that you basically like write lines of code, and every line is basically sort of executed, and then it performs a certain action, right? In Unreal Engine 5, lines are replaced by these nodes right here. These things are called nodes, and what all of the nodes do is that they perform an individual action, right? So let's say in Python, if you would write an if statement, if you know anything about programming, you know if statements are a major part of programming. In Unreal Engine 5, you don't have if statements, you have a branch node. If statements are called branch, by the way, in Unreal Engine 5. So you would just drag out of this node, right? I'll explain what these nodes are in just a bit, but you can just drag out of a node and just search for the node that you want to write. So you would just write branch. I think you can also write if, and it would just bring a branch as well. And here, essentially in a function, like, you know how you sort of pass in parameters in a function, or like in brackets, the things that you pass in, the arguments of a function, those are going to be right here. So anything you plug into this is going to be essentially the parameters or the arguments of a function. This is just going to be helpful for you if you know a programming already and you want to sort of make sense of this. If you're brand new to programming, it's perfectly fine. Just, you know, follow along with this tutorial, and it is going to be slightly hard in the beginning, but hopefully you will get it eventually. But yeah, so arguments go in here and the outputs of your function come out from this. So these pins right here, these are called execution pins, right? And execution pins, what they do is that they basically execute code. So essentially just the way this would work in a normal programming language would be, if I just open Notepad and I show you how I would write this in Python, for example, just in case you have any Python experience, what you would do is you would just do def begin play. All right, so essentially this is a function, right? You basically just like define a function like this. If you don't know Python, by the way, you can just skip ahead like a minute or two. I'm just going to be explaining this to the Python folks out there because it's going to be it's going to make it very easy for you guys to, you know, understand it. And then let's say you do in a condition, you can just plug in whatever you want. So if x is greater than y, for example, this would essentially be this node right here. But obviously our condition is not plugged in this. We already obviously have a condition. But yeah, anything out of this which goes inside yes is gonna like whatever. Like for example, print. My bad. I'm not used to. I've never, in fact, wrote Python in this, so if I make any syntax errors, my bad. But yeah, or alternatively, what you can do is you can just do else print no. So the way this would work inside of Unreal Engine 5 would be that I'm just gonna keep this up. So if the condition is true, it's gonna print hello world. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna drag off the true pin, and I'm just gonna search for print string. Again, print string is basically the same command as Python, but in this, you have to search for commands as opposed to just write them. And you can just write whatever you want to print, hello world. And the false one, we had print no. So if we drag out the false pin, we can just search for print string again, and we can just type in no. So I really hope it made a little bit of sense, especially if you have any programming language, you would know that, you know, it's very similar to how you write code in what do you call it, in an actual programming language, but, you know, just the way the code is written, that's different. The logic part and everything else is going to be basically the same. All right, so let's get back. Let me just delete all these nodes, and then we can sort of move on to just, I'm going to explain you guys what these nodes are, and let's continue with that. So right now, what you're going to see, first things first, you're going to see these events, right? These things right here, they're called events. And what happens is that this event is called event begin play. This event will be called, or it will run whenever your game starts. So if you want anything to be done right after the game starts, you can do it right here. And this event right here is going to run every single frame basically. So anything you put in this, it's going to be run. It's going to be, that code is going to be run every single frame of the game, right? So let me first show you an example of how the event begin play works. So if I just drag out of this pin, and if I just type anything to like find a node basically to add, I can just search for print. And what print string is that it's essentially just going to display something on our screen, right? And I can just write game started. If I just write that here, if I compile it, you have to make sure to compile everything, by the way. If you don't compile anything, it won't run. Now if I just go ahead and press play, you're gonna see that on the top left hand side we have game started for a few seconds, then it disappears. Once again, you can see game started right there. Perfect. So that's how essentially it works. Now if I go ahead and add the same thing to my bad, I'm just gonna search for print string. If I add the same thing to event tick, you're gonna see that game running, for example. Now you're going to see that we're going to have a whole bunch of print strings. You can see that it just keeps going. It's never going to stop. and every single frame of this game, we're going to have one more instance of that being printed. So that's how both of these work. I'm going to delete these. And now we can essentially just hook anything we want to do to this event begin play and event tick. We're not going to be using event tick, so I'm going to delete that. I just clicked on it and pressed delete key on my keyboard. You can also, I think, if I undo that, you can right click it and also delete it like that as well. So essentially what we're trying to do is that the moment the game starts, we want to create a timer. And basically if that timer ends, you would lose the game. But if the timer doesn't end and you reach the end point, it would want to essentially just show a screen which says you won and the game will end, right? So what we want to do is that we want to drag out of this executable pin. So what this this arrow right here, this thing right here, what this says is that after this happens, when this is called, when this runs, what do you want to do after this, right? So what you want to do is you want to do set timer by event. And you just select this one right here. Now, obviously you didn't know this node existed, right? Every node that you learn, most of the nodes that you learn are going to be from like tutorials, from courses. You are going to be taught nodes, right? Different types of nodes that you can use. Or you can like find some nodes by yourself as well. Like you can just go to the internet. You can be like, how do I set a timer in Unreal Engine 5? And you're going to find out the exact name of the node that you want to use, right? So you can see this line right here. When the event begin play will be called, when this will run, when the game starts, it's essentially gonna, you can tell from this line that it's essentially going to be running this function after this, right? This node right here. And so what this does is that basically when this happens is that essentially it's going to start a timer, right? What is going to be the time exactly? You can see this time right here, this thing. If I just remove this and if I say like, let's say 10 seconds, right? 10. If I write 10, it's going to run, set a timer for 10 seconds. What exactly happens after those 10 seconds? This event right here, this is going to be called, right? You can just plug this into anything else. That thing will essentially run after 10 seconds, if that makes sense. And now this, you can see that after this, we also have an executable pin on this as well. But we also have this thing called return value. What exactly is this? This is basically the time that you have currently remaining, right? So what you want to do is you want to create a variable and put the time that you currently have inside that variable. If you don't know what variables are, I'm going to be introducing you to them right now. So if you go to this, to the left side of your Blueprint editor, you can see this thing called variables, and you have this plus icon right here. So if you click this, you can see that we can create a new variable. I'm just going to call this time remaining, because obviously, you know, you want to name your variables to things that they're going to be holding. Now, if you don't know what variables are essentially like containers of data. They can contain anything that you want, and different types of variables contain different things. So if I just click here, you can see all the types of variables that we have. So I'm just going to give you guys an overview of the main types of variables that we use in programming or in game development as well. So the first one is going to be Boolean. A Boolean either stores true or false. Basically, it stores yes or no, right? These are the two values that it can store. An integer would be, and you can see that I'm skipping some on purpose. The reason for that is because I only want to introduce you guys to the essential ones right now. Byte for us is not very, very relevant. An integer is basically a whole number. So for example, 10 or 5 or 2 or 3, these are whole numbers, right? As opposed to that, if you have a float, what a float is that it can basically hold any number which has a decimal. So 3.5 is going to be a float, but 3 is going to be an integer. Do note that even if it's 3.0, that's still going to be a float, right? Any number which has a decimal point, that is going to be a float, right? After that, we have string. Strings are basically text, essentially. So if you remember when we had this print, my bad. If I just search for print, you can see that print string. What this does is that basically you can see that this text right here, this is called a string, right? So this is, my bad. If I just delete this, we also have this string variable here as well, right? Apart from that, none of these are going to be very relevant for you, at least at a basic level. Obviously, you can see that we have a whole bunch of different, variables. And also we sort of have custom variables for different things. For example, right now what do you want? We want time remaining, right? So we have a specific type of variable inside of Unreal Engine 5, which I want you guys to know, and that is timer handle. So if I just search for timer handle, you're going to see that we have a timer handle variable. And these variables are essentially built upon the basic ones that I just showed you, right? So this is the variable that you're going to be using, timer handle. And once you have this created right here, what you can do is you can just drag this into your Blueprint editor, or event graph as this is called. And you have two options basically, either to get the current value of the variable or to set a new value of the variable, right? We want to set it. The reason why we want to set it is because we want to take the current time remaining from this and just plug it into this. And also the return value, you want to plug the return value into the time remaining. I know this must feel like magic for now, and it makes zero sense when you're first learning this. So if it doesn't make sense to you, you're completely normal. There's nothing to worry about. As we go through this course and as you take, more courses, as you sort of advance your journey, trust me, well, 1 week from now or 1 month from now, you're going to be looking back at this time and you're going to be like, this is just very basic stuff. This makes total sense. So even if it doesn't make sense to you right now, that's perfectly fine. Don't worry about it at all. Just copy what I'm doing, try your best to understand, and also try to watch these videos again and again. And as you watch these videos more and more times, you're going to be understanding more. So now we have this time remaining thing, right? What we can do now is basically, if you want to see the current time, also we can like resize these windows, by the way. And so now we basically have a function which sort of creates a timer, and we have the timer set as well, right? Now what we want to do is that we want to basically sort of, for example, we want to print timer finished on the screen when the timer ends, basically. So what we can do is we can right click this, print string. You already know how to do this, right? Time ended, timer ended, perfect. And now what we can do is that we can basically sort of take this and just plug it into something which will be called when the timer basically ends. But you can see that right now there's no way of like connecting these two directly, right? There's no way of like connecting these two directly. So what you're going to do is that you're going to right click, you're going to search for custom event and just click add custom event. Now what I'm going to call this, I'm going to call this timer ended. Okay. So what this is going to do is that basically this is going to have this red pin right here. This is essentially what this does is that basically it can be called by these timer events as well. So what you can do is you can just take this and plug it into like this. And then this execution pin, you can plug this into the print string one. So I hope it made sense. If it didn't, I'll explain it again. So this is going to be called when the game starts. The timer will be created. And so basically what this event thing does is that basically the moment that this timer ends is going to send a signal back to this. And then this event will be called. And this event, the execution pin, leads you to the print string, which is going to display timer ended on our screen. I hope it makes sense. It's actually pretty easy. If it doesn't make sense for now, it's perfectly fine. It is going to make sense eventually. One thing you want to make sure is that after you make any sort of changes in your event graph, you want to go up and click compile. And this is going to essentially just make sure that all changes are being saved. Now we can just play the game and you're going to see that it's not going to show us anything for now because obviously the timer is not completed yet. But if we wait for just 10 seconds, we should see, hopefully you can see that on the top left hand corner, we saw timer ended for just a moment before it disappeared, right? So it's working, right? But one problem that we have is that the timer will still be running. We are not really sort of invalidating the timer or just destroying the timer by itself, right? It's not going to do that automatically. We're going to have to do that by ourselves. So instead of this, what we can do is that we can just come here and say invalidate timer, clear and invalidate timer by handle. This is something that you need to do. It's just important because obviously once you start a timer, you need to also end the timer as well. Basically just destroy the timer. And just make sure that it's not being used. This is going to ask you for a handle, and the handle in this situation is going to be the time remaining. So we're just going to get time remaining and just plug it into this like that. Now this might not have made sense to some of you guys, and that's perfectly fine. It's going to make sense eventually as we go on. Just don't worry about it too much right now. But yeah, just know that this is also sort of being used as an identifier for this this timer event. So basically what this is going to do is that this is going to take in this timer. And this timer, this time remaining variable, timer handle, is going to essentially identify this timer and it's going to invalidate that. Okay, and compile it. And after that, we can also do whatever you want. We can just print string or do whatever, and that's perfectly fine as well. But just an important step when you're creating timers is just to invalidate and clear and invalidate them as well. All right, so now we have a working timer that we can, use. But the problem is that we're using this print string thing right here, which is not really looking good on our screen. Like if I just, change the text again, timer ended. And if I just set the timer time to essentially just 3 seconds, so we waste less time when we're testing it, you can see that it's really gonna, just display like a small text on the top left corner, and it's not really looking good, and it looks pretty bad. So let's go ahead and create a widget